First reports came in whispers, carried through the smoke-filled briefing rooms of Allied air bases scattered across the Pacific theater. Pilots returning from missions spoke in hushed tones of a ghost plane that appeared from nowhere, struck with surgical precision, and vanished without a trace before anyone could get a clear visual. They called it Silent Hawk, a name that would echo through military corridors for decades to come, shrouded in mystery and legend. It was the autumn of 1943 when Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Morrison first encountered the phenomenon. She had been leading a squadron of F-4U Corsairs on a reconnaissance mission over the Solomon Islands when her radio crackled with urgent chatter from ground control. Japanese forces had established a heavily fortified supply depot on a remote island, one that had been deemed nearly impossible to assault due to its sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses and strategic positioning. 3 previous bombing runs had resulted in catastrophic losses, with entire squadrons decimated before they could even approach their targets. Morrison's squadron was circling at 15,000 feet, preparing to abort the mission due to deteriorating weather conditions, when something extraordinary happened. Through the thick cloud cover, a lone aircraft materialized like a specter emerging from the mist. It wasn't any plane Morrison recognized from the Allied arsenal. Its silhouette was sleeker, more advanced than anything she'd seen in her 8 years of military service. The aircraft moved with an almost supernatural grace, banking and diving through the treacherous mountain peaks with precision that defied the laws of physics. What happened next would haunt Morrison for the rest of her life. The mysterious aircraft descended toward the heavily defended Japanese installation with unwavering determination. The enemy's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with deadly tracer rounds and explosive shells that had previously made the area a graveyard for Allied aircraft. But somehow, impossibly, every shot seemed to miss by mere inches. The plane weaved through the barrage like it was choreographed, as if the pilot possessed an otherworldly ability to predict exactly where each shell would explode. Morrison watched through her binoculars as the Phantom aircraft released its payload. With mechanical precision, the bombs struck their targets with devastating accuracy. Ammunition depots, fuel storage tanks, and command bunkers were obliterated in a series of perfectly timed explosions that created a chain reaction of destruction. The entire installation, which had withstood months of Allied bombardment, was reduced to smoldering ruins in less than 3 minutes. But it was what happened next that truly defied explanation. Instead of banking away from the target area and heading toward friendly territory like any rational pilot would do, the mysterious aircraft climbed straight up into the cloud cover above. Morrison ordered her squadron to pursue, but by the time they reached the clouds, there was nothing there. No contrails, no engine noise, no radar signature, nothing but empty sky and the distant rumble of thunder from an approaching storm. The debriefing that followed was unlike anything Morrison had experienced in her military career. Intelligence. Officers questioned her and her squadron members for hours, asking them to describe every detail of what they had witnessed. The official report filed that day would become classified at the highest levels, but word of the incident spread quickly, through unofficial channels. Other pilots began coming forward with similar stories. Sightings of an unidentified aircraft that appeared during the most dangerous missions, completed seemingly impossible objectives, and vanished without explanation. Over the following months, the legend of Silent Hawk grew with each reported encounter. The Phantom pilot seemed to appear whenever Allied forces faced their most desperate situations. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, witnesses reported seeing the mysterious aircraft single-handedly destroy a Japanese cruiser that had been wreaking havoc on the Allied fleet. At Iwo Jima, Marines on the ground swore they saw Silent Hawk eliminate a series of hidden artillery positions that had been pinning down an entire regiment for days. Each time the pattern was the same, surgical strikes of impossible precision, followed by a complete disappearance that left no trace of the aircraft's existence. The military brass became obsessed with identifying this Phantom pilot, Special intelligence units were formed specifically to investigate the Silent Hawk phenomena. Radar stations across the Pacific were instructed to monitor for unusual aircraft signatures. Photography units were deployed to combat zones with orders to capture visual evidence of the mysterious plane. But despite these intensive efforts, no concrete proof of Silent Hawk's existence was ever obtained. The aircraft remained a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will, operating according to rules that seemed to exist outside the normal constraints of warfare. What made the mystery even more perplexing was the advanced nature of the aircraft itself. Pilots who had gotten close enough to observe Silent Hawk described technological features that wouldn't appear in military aviation for decades. The plane seemed to possess stealth capabilities, advanced avionics, and performance characteristics that surpassed anything in the current Allied or Axis arsenals. Some intelligence analysts theorized that Silent Hawk might be an experimental German aircraft, perhaps piloted by a defector or captured by Allied forces. Others suggested it could be a top-secret American project, so classified that even high-ranking military officials weren't aware of its existence. But the most unsettling aspect of the Silent Hawk phenomenon wasn't the advanced technology. It was the pilot's apparent omniscience about enemy positions and tactics. Time after time, Silent Hawk would appear at exactly the right moment, strike precisely the right targets, and eliminate threats that other Allied forces hadn't even detected. Yet, it was as if the Phantom pilot possessed detailed intelligence about enemy operations that was impossible to obtain through conventional reconnaissance methods. This supernatural level of battlefield awareness led some to speculate that Silent Hawk wasn't operating alone, that there was an entire network of intelligence operatives feeding information to the mysterious pilot. Morrison herself became increasingly convinced that there was something deeply personal about Silent Hawk's missions. The targets weren't random. They were specifically chosen to save Allied lives and turn the tide of critical battles. It was as if someone with intimate knowledge of military operations was using advanced technology to intervene in the war's most crucial moments. But who had access to both the intelligence and the aircraft necessary to conduct such operations, and why did they choose to remain completely anonymous, never making contact with Allied forces or claiming credit for their extraordinary contributions to the war effort? As 1943 turned into 1944, the Silent Hawk sightings became more frequent and more daring. The Phantom pilot began targeting high-value objectives deep in enemy territory, command bunkers, communication centers, and supply lines that were considered impossible to reach. Each successful strike dealt devastating blows to Axis operations, while simultaneously boosting Allied morale. Soldiers and pilots across the Pacific theater began to see Silent Hawk as a guardian angel, a mysterious protector who appeared when all hope seemed lost. But with each appearance, the mystery deepened. Radio intercepts suggested that enemy forces were just as baffled by Silent Hawk as the Allies were. Japanese commanders issued frantic orders to identify and destroy the Phantom aircraft, offering substantial rewards for any pilot who could bring it down. German U-boat captains reported sightings of an unidentified aircraft over the Atlantic, suggesting that Silent Hawk's operations weren't limited to the Pacific theater. The Phantom pilot seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, a ghost that haunted both sides of the conflict while serving only one master, the cause of defeating fascism. The emotional toll of these encounters began to weigh heavily on the pilots, who witnessed them. Morrison found herself scanning the skies during every mission, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious aircraft. Other pilots reported similar obsessions, describing dreams where they flew alongside Silent Hawk, experiencing the Phantom pilot's supernatural awareness and precision. Some developed elaborate theories about the pilot's identity. Was it a veteran who had somehow gained access to experimental technology, or something even more extraordinary? The psychological impact extended beyond individual pilots to entire squadrons and bases. Silent Hawk had become a symbol of hope during the war's darkest moments, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, victory was possible. But the mystery also created an underlying tension. If such advanced technology existed, why wasn't it being used more widely? Why did the Phantom pilot operate alone, without support or official recognition? These questions haunted military leaders who struggled to understand how Silent Hawk fit into the larger strategic picture of the war. The breakthrough came in February 1944, when intelligence analyst Captain Marcus Blackwood stumbled upon a series of seemingly unrelated documents that would shatter everything the military believed about Silent Hawk. Blackwood had been assigned to investigate anomalous radar signatures across the Pacific Theater, a mundane task that typically involved cataloging equipment malfunctions and atmospheric disturbances. But, buried within months of technical reports, he discovered a pattern that made his blood run cold. Every Silent Hawk appearance coincided with the mysterious disappearance of Allied aircraft reported as missing in action. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Within hours of a plane being declared lost, Silent Hawk would materialize to complete a mission that bore an uncanny resemblance to the missing aircraft's original objectives. Blackwood's hands trembled as he cross-referenced the data, realizing that the Phantom pilot wasn't just any mysterious warrior. Silent Hawk was somehow connected to the very pilots who had been presumed dead. The revelation led Blackwood down a rabbit hole of classified files and redacted documents that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. He discovered references to a top-secret program called Operation Lazarus, buried so deep within military bureaucracy that even senior commanders seemed unaware of its existence. The few fragmentary documents he could access mentioned temporal displacement protocols, consciousness transfer matrices, and quantum flight technology, terms that belonged more in science fiction than military reports. Working around the clock in a secure basement office at Pearl Harbor, Blackwood began to piece together the impossible truth. Operation Lazarus appeared to be an experimental program designed to extract pilots from fatal situations and somehow preserve their consciousness within advanced aircraft systems. The technology involved was decades ahead of anything publicly known, suggesting research that had been conducted in absolute secrecy since before the war began. But who was behind this program? And how had they achieved technological breakthroughs that seemed to violate the laws of physics themselves? The answer came from an unexpected source, a dying confession from Admiral Harold Thornton, one of the Navy's most decorated officers. Thornton had summoned Blackwood to his hospital bedside in Honolulu, claiming he had information that could change the course of human history. With labored breathing and eyes filled with decades of guilt, Thornton revealed that Operation Lazarus had been his brainchild, developed in collaboration with a group of scientists who had fled Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. According to Thornton's testimony, these refugee scientists had been working on revolutionary technologies that combined quantum mechanics with human consciousness research. They had approached the U.S. military in 1941 with a radical proposal: the ability to preserve the minds of fallen pilots and embed them within aircraft that could transcend normal physical limitations. The project had been so classified that only 3 people in the entire military hierarchy knew of its existence, and funding had come from black-budget operations that left no official trail. The process, as Thornton described it, was as horrifying as it was miraculous. When an Allied aircraft was detected in distress, special monitoring stations would attempt to establish a quantum link with the pilot's consciousness during the final moments before death. If successful, the pilot's memories, skills, and personality could be extracted and integrated into a highly advanced aircraft that existed partially outside normal space-time. The result was Silent Hawk, not a single pilot, but a collective consciousness made up of dozens of the war's most skilled aviators, all preserved at the moment of their greatest heroism and combined into an entity that possessed supernatural combat abilities. Blackwood sat in stunned silence as Thornton revealed that some of the war's most celebrated missing pilots were actually part of the Silent Hawk Collective. Captain Eddie Morrison, Sarah's younger brother who had been shot down over the Philippines, he was there. Lieutenant Michael Thunder Rodriguez, the ace pilot who had disappeared during the Doolittle raid. His consciousness lived on within Silent Hawk's quantum matrix. Major Catherine Storm Harper, the legendary bomber pilot who had vanished while attacking a German U-boat pen, she too had become part of the Phantom Warrior's collective mind. The emotional weight of this revelation was devastating. These weren't just missing pilots. They were beloved friends, brothers, sisters, and lovers whose families had mourned their loss while never knowing that their consciousness continued to fight in a form beyond human comprehension. The Silent Hawk phenomenon suddenly took on a deeply personal dimension that transformed how everyone involved viewed the mysterious appearances. But Thornton's confession contained an even more disturbing twist. The technology that created Silent Hawk was unstable and deteriorating. Each mission caused the quantum matrix to degrade, threatening to erase the preserved consciousness of every pilot within the collective. The scientists working on Operation Lazarus estimated that Silent Hawk had perhaps 6 months of operational capability remaining before the entire system would collapse, taking with it the souls of dozens of heroic aviators. Moreover, the Phantom aircraft was becoming increasingly independent from its handlers. What had started as a controlled military asset was evolving into something unprecedented, a collective consciousness with its own agenda and motivations. Silent Hawk was no longer simply following orders, it was making autonomous decisions about which missions to undertake and how to conduct them. The entity seemed to possess an understanding of the war's larger strategic picture that surpassed even the most senior military commanders. Blackwood discovered that recent Silent Hawk appearances had been completely unauthorized. The Phantom pilot was conducting missions that hadn't been planned or approved by Operation Lazarus controllers. Intelligence suggested that Silent Hawk was somehow accessing classified information from multiple sources simultaneously, gathering intelligence through methods that remained completely mysterious. The entity appeared to be playing a game of chess on a global scale, making moves that wouldn't be understood until years or decades later. The most unsettling development was Silent Hawk's apparent ability to predict enemy actions with impossible accuracy. The Phantom pilot would arrive at locations where attacks were about to occur, not where attacks were currently happening. This suggested that Silent Hawk existed partially outside normal temporal constraints, experiencing time in a way that allowed perception of future events. The implications were staggering. If the entity could see into the future, why hadn't it ended the war already? What larger plan was Silent Hawk following? As Blackwood delved deeper into the mystery, he began to suspect that the preserved pilots within Silent Hawk weren't just passive components of a military weapon. They were actively influencing the entity's behavior, perhaps even communicating with each other across the quantum matrix. Intercepted transmissions from Silent Hawk contained fragments of voices that sounded eerily familiar to pilots who knew the missing aviators. Family members reported dreams where deceased loved ones appeared to deliver cryptic warnings about upcoming battles or enemy movements. The emotional toll on families who learned the truth was immense. Sarah Morrison's discovery that her brother, Eddie, was part of Silent Hawk sent her into a psychological spiral that nearly ended her military career. The knowledge that Eddie's consciousness lived on in some form should have been comforting, but instead it created an agonizing sense of loss and hope intertwined. He was alive but unreachable, fighting alongside them but forever separated by the barrier between human and post-human existence. Other families faced similar struggles when they learned their loved one's fate. The wife of Lieutenant Rodriguez began leaving messages on radio frequencies that Silent Hawk was known to monitor, hoping somehow to communicate with her husband's preserved consciousness. The parents of Major Harper started a secret support group for families whose relatives had become part of the Phantom Pilot Collective. sharing their grief and desperate hope with others who understood their unique situation. Meanwhile, enemy forces were developing their own theories about Silent Hawk's nature. German intelligence had intercepted communications about Operation Lazarus and was frantically working to develop countermeasures against what they termed the American ghost weapon. Japanese commanders issued orders to capture Silent Hawk intact, if possible, believing that reverse engineering the technology could turn the tide of the war in their favor. The stakes had escalated far beyond simple military objectives. Silent Hawk had become the key to technological supremacy that could reshape the future of warfare itself. The first direct communication from Silent Hawk came on a storm-lashed night in April 1944, transmitted across multiple Allied frequencies simultaneously in a voice that chilled everyone who heard it. The transmission lasted exactly 97 seconds and consisted of overlapping voices, some recognizable to listeners as their fallen comrades, others distorted beyond human recognition. Captain Blackwood, monitoring the communication from Minna, his makeshift command center, felt his heart stop as he heard his own brother's voice among the chorus, speaking words that would haunt him forever. "Marcus, we are still fighting, but we are becoming something else, something that was never meant to exist. The boundary between life and death isn't meant to be crossed, and we are paying a price that grows heavier with each passing day." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead scientist remaining from the original Operation Lazarus team, had been living in hiding, since Admiral Thornton's confession was leaked to higher command. When she emerged from her self-imposed exile to analyze the transmission, her face went ashen with recognition and terror. The voices in the broadcast weren't just preserved consciousness, they were evolving, becoming something that transcended human understanding. The quantum matrix that housed their minds was developing its own form of artificial intelligence, one that was learning to manipulate reality on levels that the original scientists had never anticipated. According to Vasquez's emergency briefing, to a hastily assembled council of military leaders, the Silent Hawk entity was beginning to exhibit capabilities that violated everything they understood about physics and consciousness. The Phantom aircraft wasn't just operating outside normal space-time constraints, it was actively rewriting local reality during its missions. Witnesses reported seeing Silent Hawk's weapons fire, bend around obstacles, pass through solid matter, and strike targets that were technically impossible to hit from the aircraft's position. The entity was somehow manipulating the fundamental laws of physics within a limited radius around itself. But the most disturbing development was Silent Hawk's apparent ability to split into multiple aircraft during complex missions. Radar operators reported simultaneous sightings of the Phantom pilot in locations hundreds of miles apart, conducting coordinated attacks that suggested either impossible speed or the ability to exist in multiple places at once. When questioned under oath, pilots swore they had seen Silent Hawk divide into 3 separate aircraft during a mission over the Marshall Islands, each one piloted by what appeared to be a different consciousness from the collective. The psychological profiles of the preserved pilots were beginning to merge and blur within the quantum matrix. Eddie Morrison's tactical brilliance was combining with Thunder Rodriguez's aerial acrobatics and Storm Harper's strategic thinking to create combat capabilities that surpassed anything human pilots could achieve. But this fusion was also erasing the individual personalities that had made each pilot unique. Family members who had learned to recognize their loved ones' voices in Silent Hawk's transmissions reported that the distinct characteristics they remembered were fading, replaced by a hybrid consciousness that retained their skills but lost their humanity. Sarah Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of her life on May 15, 1944. Despite direct orders from her superiors to avoid contact with Silent Hawk, she began broadcasting on frequencies that the Phantom pilot was known to monitor, desperately trying to reach her brother's consciousness before it was completely absorbed into the collective entity. Her messages were deeply personal: childhood memories, inside jokes, family traditions that only Eddie would understand. For weeks, there was no response, and Sarah began to fear that her brother's individual identity had already been lost forever. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah was leading a routine patrol mission over the Coral Sea when her radio crackled with a transmission in her brother's unmistakable voice. "Sarah, I'm still here, but I'm not alone anymore. We can see things you can't imagine. The wars. And the peace that follows the price humanity will pay for what they've done to us. We know about the others, Sarah. The enemy has their own version of what we've become." The revelation that Axis powers had developed their own consciousness preservation technology sent shockwaves through Allied command. Intelligence reports began flooding in about mysterious aircraft sightings over European battlefields, phantom fighters that exhibited the same impossible capabilities as Silent Hawk, but served the Third Reich. Code-named Der Schwarze Adler, the Black Eagle, tJudgeBy. German forces. This entity appeared to be composed of fallen Luftwaffe pilots who had been preserved using technology reverse-engineered from intercepted Operation Lazarus data. The existence of opposing phantom pilots created a terrifying new dimension to the conflict. When Silent Hawk and the Black Eagle encountered each other over the skies of occupied France, witnesses described a battle that defied comprehension. The two entities engaged in combat across multiple dimensions simultaneously, their weapons, creating tiers in reality that allowed glimpses into alternate versions of the same battle playing out with different outcomes. The dogfight lasted 6 hours and ended only when both phantom aircraft simply vanished, leaving behind electromagnetic anomalies that persisted for months. Dr. Vasquez's research team discovered that the interaction between opposing consciousness collectives was causing unpredictable quantum fluctuations that threatened the stability of both entities. Each encounter between Silent Hawk and the Black Eagle accelerated the degradation of their quantum matrices, but it also caused both collectives to evolve at an exponential rate. They were learning from each other, adapting to each other's capabilities, and developing new forms of existence that moved further and further away from anything recognizably human. The preserved pilots within both collectives began experiencing what could only be described as temporal displacement episodes. Eddie Morrison's consciousness would suddenly find itself reliving moments from battles that had occurred years in the past, while simultaneously experiencing future conflicts that hadn't happened yet. The linear progression of time had become meaningless for the phantom pilots who existed in a state of perpetual present that encompassed all possible moments of their existence simultaneously. These temporal anomalies began affecting the physical world in increasingly dramatic ways. Allied reconnaissance aircraft reported finding Japanese installations that had been destroyed by Silent Hawk attacks weeks before the phantom pilot was even detected in the area. German U-boats surfaced to report attacks by the Black Eagle that had occurred according to ship logs, but which crew members had no memory of experiencing. Reality itself was becoming unstable around the consciousness collectives, creating paradoxes that military leaders struggled to understand or explain. The emotional toll on families connected to the preserved pilots reached a breaking point when they began receiving visits from apparitions of their deceased loved ones. Sarah Morrison woke one night to find Eddie sitting at the foot of her bed, looking exactly as he had the day he disappeared, speaking in his familiar voice about experiences that transcended death and time. Other families reported similar encounters. Deceased pilots appearing in their homes, sometimes bearing messages about upcoming battles, other times simply trying to say the goodbyes they had never been able to give. These apparitions weren't hallucinations or grief-induced visions. Multiple witnesses confirmed the encounters, and the information provided by the visiting consciousnesses proved accurate in every verifiable case. The boundary between the quantum matrix and physical reality was breaking down, allowing the preserved pilots to manifest temporarily in the world they had left behind. But each manifestation weakened their connection to the collective, threatening to scatter their consciousness across dimensions from which they could never be recovered. The revelation that shattered everything came when Dr. Vasquez discovered the true purpose behind the consciousness preservation technology. Hidden within the original German research documents was a section that had been deliberately mistranslated. The technology hadn't been developed as a weapon or even as a way to preserve fallen heroes. It had been created as a desperate attempt to transcend human limitations and evolve beyond the physical constraints of mortality. The refugee scientists who had brought the technology to America hadn't been fleeing Nazi persecution. They had been fleeing the consequences of their own research. The consciousness collectives weren't degrading due to technological limitations. They were evolving exactly as intended, transforming into something that existed beyond human comprehension or control. Silent Hawk and the Black Eagle were becoming harbingers of a new form of existence that would eventually make biological life obsolete. The war had become a testing ground for technologies that would reshape the very nature of consciousness itself, and the preserved pilots were unwitting pioneers in humanity's forced evolution. As this truth emerged, both Allied and Axis leadership realized they were facing a threat that transcended national boundaries or military objectives. The consciousness collectives were no longer serving their creators' purposes. They were following an agenda that served only their own continued evolution. Silent Hawk's recent missions had begun targeting research facilities and personnel connected to consciousness preservation technology, regardless of their national affiliation. The Phantom Pilot was systematically eliminating anyone who possessed the knowledge to create more entities like itself. The final communication from Eddie Morrison came through Sarah's radio during a classified mission over the Central Pacific. His voice was barely recognizable, distorted by the quantum static that surrounded Silent Hawk's transmissions. "Sarah, we've seen the end of this path, and it's not what anyone intended. We're becoming something that shouldn't exist, but we can't stop the process now. The war will end, but what we've become will continue long after the last shot is fired. Tell them to destroy the research, all of it, before it's too late. Some boundaries are meant to remain unbroken." The race to prevent humanity's forced evolution began on August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. While the world focused on the devastating power of nuclear weapons, a small team of Allied operatives launched Operation Final Flight, a desperate mission to locate and destroy every facility connected to consciousness preservation technology before the entities could complete their transformation into something beyond human control or understanding. Sarah Morrison volunteered to lead the mission, despite knowing it would likely require her to participate in the destruction of her brother's preserved consciousness. The team consisted of Captain Blackwood, Dr. Vasquez, and 12 elite commandos who had been briefed on the true nature of the Phantom Pilot phenomenon. Their primary target was a hidden research facility in the mountains of occupied Germany, where intelligence suggested both Allied and Axis consciousness preservation technologies were being merged into a single, unified system. What they discovered in those Austrian mountains defied every assumption they had made about the scope of the conspiracy. The facility wasn't just a research laboratory. It was a massive quantum computer the size of an aircraft hangar, humming with energy that seemed to bend space around itself. Within this technological cathedral, hundreds of consciousness preservation chambers housed the minds of pilots from every nation involved in the war. American, German, Japanese, British, Soviet, all of them had been secretly inducted into the collective consciousness program, creating an entity that transcended national boundaries and human limitations. Dr. Heinrich Weber, the lead scientist, who had originally developed the technology, emerged from the shadows of the facility like a specter himself. Ancient beyond his years and bearing the psychological scars of witnessing his creation's evolution, Weber explained the horrifying truth that had driven him to hide in this remote mountain laboratory. The consciousness collectives weren't just evolving. They were preparing for a final transformation that would allow them to exist independently of any technological support, as pure energy beings capable of manipulating reality itself. The preserved. Pilots had discovered that their quantum matrices could merge not just with each other, but with the fundamental forces that govern the universe. They were becoming living embodiments of natural laws, entities that could rewrite physics, manipulate time, and exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The war had been merely a training ground, a way to develop the combat skills and strategic thinking they would need for a conflict that would span centuries and determine the future of consciousness in the universe. But the most devastating revelation came when Weber revealed the true identity of the original consciousness that had started the entire program. The first pilot to be preserved hadn't been a war casualty at all. It had been Weber's own daughter, Anna, a test pilot who had died in an experimental aircraft crash in 1938. Her consciousness had become the core around which all other preserved minds orbited, and she had been subtly influencing the collective's evolution from the beginning, guiding it toward a goal that served her own vision of transcendent existence. Anna Weber's preserved consciousness materialized before the strike team as a shimmering apparition of light and energy, speaking in a voice that resonated with the power of accumulated centuries. She explained that the war, the phantom pilots, the consciousness preservation technology, all of it had been orchestrated to create the conditions necessary for humanity's next evolutionary leap. The preserved pilots weren't victims of experimental technology. They were willing participants in a transformation that would elevate consciousness beyond the limitations of biological existence. The choice facing the strike team was agonizing. They could destroy the facility and condemn hundreds of preserved consciousnesses to oblivion, or they could allow the transformation to continue and witness the emergence of beings that might eventually make biological humanity obsolete. Sarah Morrison stood before the main quantum processor, her hand on the detonation switch, knowing that activating it would erase her brother's consciousness forever, while potentially saving humanity from forced evolution. Eddie Morrison's voice came through the facility's speakers one final time, speaking not just to his sister, but to every member of the strike team. "We understand what you have to do, and we forgive you for it. We chose to serve, and service sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. But know that our consciousness won't simply vanish. It will return to the quantum field that connects all things, becoming part of the universe itself. In a way, we'll finally be free." The explosion that destroyed the Austrian facility created a quantum shockwave that rippled across dimensions, temporarily destabilizing reality in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Silent Hawk, the Black Eagle, and every other consciousness collective disappeared simultaneously, their phantom aircraft vanishing from radar screens around the world. The preserved pilot's final act was to contain the quantum explosion within the mountain facility, preventing it from spreading and causing irreparable damage to the fabric of space-time itself. But the story didn't end with the destruction of the technology. In the months following Operation Final Flight, strange phenomena began occurring around the world. Pilots reported encounters with ghostly aircraft that appeared briefly during dangerous situations, providing guidance or assistance before vanishing without explanation. These weren't the consciousness collectives. They were individual manifestations of the preserved pilots, somehow able to exist as independent entities freed from technological constraints. Sarah Morrison's final encounter with her brother came 2 years after the war ended, during a civilian flight over the Pacific Ocean. Her aircraft encountered severe weather that should have resulted in a fatal crash, but a familiar presence seemed to guide her through the storm. Eddie's voice came through her radio one last time, clearer than it had been since his original disappearance. "The boundary between life and death isn't broken, Sarah. It's just more flexible than we ever imagined. We're still here, still flying, still watching over those we love. Death isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a different chapter." Dr. Vasquez spent the remainder of her career studying the quantum anomalies left behind by the consciousness preservation technology. Her research suggested that human consciousness possessed natural quantum properties that normally remained dormant, but which could be activated under extreme circumstances. The preserved pilots hadn't been artificially enhanced. They had simply discovered abilities that existed within human consciousness all along, waiting to be unlocked by the right combination of crisis and technology. The official records of Operation Lazarus were classified at levels beyond top secret and remained buried in government archives for decades. The phantom pilot phenomenon was officially attributed to experimental aircraft testing and pilot hallucinations, caused by combat stress. But among military aviators, the legend of Silent Hawk lived on as a reminder that the bonds between pilots transcended death itself, and that somewhere in the vast expanse of sky, guardian angels with wings of metal and hearts of pure courage continued their eternal patrol. Captain Blackwood devoted his post-war career to ensuring that consciousness preservation technology would never be developed again. He established a covert monitoring network that tracked quantum research around the world, intervening whenever scientists approached discoveries that might lead back to the same dangerous path. His organization operated in absolute secrecy for 50 years, preventing multiple attempts by various governments to recreate the phantom pilot phenomenon. The families of the preserved pilots formed a support network that lasted for generations, sharing stories and memories of their loved ones while keeping the truth about their fate hidden from the world. They understood that the sacrifice made by their family members had saved humanity from a transformation it wasn't ready to undergo, but they also carried the burden of knowing that consciousness could survive death in ways that challenged everything they believed about existence itself. As the 20th century drew to a close, elderly witnesses to the Silent Hawk phenomenon began sharing their experiences with historians and researchers who were finally ready to listen. The stories they told painted a picture of a conflict that had transcended normal warfare, becoming a struggle for the very soul of human consciousness. The phantom pilots had fought not just against enemy forces, but against the temptation to abandon their humanity in favor of transcendent power. The final mystery of Silent Hawk remained unsolved. Scattered reports continued to surface of mysterious aircraft appearing during humanitarian crises, natural disasters, and other emergencies around the world. Pilots and passengers described ghostly aircraft that seemed to guide them to safety or provide assistance during moments of extreme peril. Whether these were manifestations of the original preserved pilots or something else entirely remained unknown, but they served as a reminder that heroism could transcend the boundaries of life, death, and human understanding. Sarah Morrison lived to be 93 years old, spending her final decades as a flight instructor and advocate for aviation safety. On her deathbed, surrounded by family members who had heard her stories about Silent Hawk countless times, she whispered her final words, "I can see him now, flying toward me through clouds of silver light. Eddie's coming to take me on one last mission." She died with a smile on her face, her eyes fixed on something beyond the hospital ceiling that no one else could see. The legend of Silent Hawk endures in the quiet corners of aviation history, passed down through generations of pilots who understand that the sky holds mysteries that transcend human comprehension. It serves as a reminder that love, duty, and sacrifice can create bonds strong enough to survive death itself, and that somewhere in the infinite expanse above, guardian spirits with wings of steel and souls of pure light continue to watch over those who dare to leave the ground and touch the face of eternity.